Today I have with me Nisrine Hilizah. Born in Khartoum, Sudan, Nisrine and her family, now from South Sudan, immigrated to the U.S. from Lebanon as refugees in 2000. In May 2021, she graduated from Sewanee, the University of the South, with a degree in International and Global Studies and a minor in Women and Gender Studies. During her undergraduate career, she participated in the U.S. Department of State's Critical Languages Scholarship Program for the study of Arabic in Morocco in 2019 and 2020. After her time in Morocco in 2019, she spent the following semester studying Syrian Refugee Integration and Humanitarian aid in Jordan and Switzerland. Inspired by her experience as a black woman in Morocco, Jordan, and later Egypt, her undergraduate thesis analyzes the ways in which anti-blackness intersects with other forms of discrimination to hinder Sudanese refugees in Jordan from accessing humanitarian aid and integrating into their host society. In the MAAS program, she hopes to continue exploring the history and development of anti-blackness in the Arab world and its impact on black sub-Saharan African refugees and asylum seekers in the region today. Upon graduating from MAAS, Nisrine hopes to find a career in humanitarianism. And that is very obvious in today's conversation. I hope you enjoy it, learn something from this amazing young woman as she has lots to teach us. Get mad, stay blessed. Here we are, brothers and sisters. Nisrine, thanks for joining.
Hi, guys.
Yeah, so, man, I've really enjoyed just the few quick conversations we've had, but I'm excited for this time because you're just on this amazing path of discovery, education, figuring out how we can solve some of these big world problems. But I guess to give people a little bit of background beyond the bio, tell us a little bit about kind of how you got where you are now and your studies and the current studies and just kind of that quick background.
Yeah, so my name is Nisrine. I was born in Khartoum, Sudan, to South Sudanese parents. We moved to the U.S. as refugees from Lebanon, actually, in 2000. Grew up in Cleveland, Tennessee, moved to Knoxville in 2007. That's kind of where my family have been based ever since. Growing up, I was very active in the Episcopal Church, and through like mission trips and youth groups and kind of service projects, both like locally and also just around the United States, I kind of found my love for activism and advocacy efforts. That then kind of translated as well into my undergraduate career. So I got my Bachelor's of Arts in International and Global Studies with a minor in Women and Gender Studies from Sewanee, the University of the South. Graduated last May. So yeah, I definitely continued that activism through, attending some protests, hosting some protests of my own on campus, kind of all these like different avenues. I don't know, I had always kind of seen myself as an advocate. However, I was also very much interested in the international as well. So my parents speak Arabic. I grew up hearing, my mom speaks to me in Juba Arabic, which is the South Sudanese dialect spoken. And so I just kind of thought that was interesting. And, my sophomore year, there's an Arabic class offered by Professor Layla King. And so I signed up for her Arabic class. I was obviously fell in love with it. I found it to be relatively easier to grasp because I grew up, we're called heritage learners when you grow up in home and kind of get exposed to it from a young age. So continued a year with her and then applied to the Critical Languages Scholarship Program offered by the U.S. Department of State. Fortunately, got it 3 times. Also, although I participated in twice, once in person, the second time it was remote. But the first time that was in person, I went to Morocco. So I was able to study Arabic, stayed with the homestay family. It was my very first time actually living outside the U.S. for like an extended amount of time since moving as a refugee. So it was absolutely phenomenal. Morocco is a predominantly Muslim country as well, so it was very interesting navigating life as a religious minority. However, I didn't really even feel that. It was just a beautiful way to get exposed to the culture, history, language, every way possible. Following my time in Morocco, I then studied abroad in Jordan. I studied Syrian Refugee Integration and Humanitarian aid in Amman, which is the capital. And then we also took a 10-day excursion to Switzerland. Met with Red Cross, UN, all of these kind of very large humanitarian organizations. Geneva is kind of the hub for all of that. My experience in Jordan was just absolutely phenomenal, transformative to say the least. I was able to find really my academic passions. So then, upon returning to the U.S., I dedicated my senior thesis to writing about Sudanese refugee integration, particularly the extent to which anti-Black racism impacts their ability to integrate into their host communities, but then also to obtain humanitarian aid. That has brought me to Georgetown University, where I'm currently pursuing a Master's of Arts in Arab Studies with a certificate in Refugees and Humanitarian Emergencies. So I'm able to continue to explore my academic interests and passions, particularly women and gender in the Arab world, anti-blackness in the Arab world, humanitarian action. So yeah, that's kind of like my area of expertise, if you will.
So put yourself like back a few years, probably more than a few years. If I was your age and you said, tell me a little bit about your studies now, I'd be like, well, I graduated from high school with a 2.7 and decided to not go to college. Man, you put people like me to shame, Nisrine. I love it. I love it. No, it's like super cool. I kind of want to hit back on Morocco. So I definitely want to dive into the anti-blackness side a little bit later, but I'm curious about your time there as a Black person, but also as an Arab speaker, because I think, if you're listening, you don't know, Sudan's in East Africa, and not too long ago, it split from north to south. And for those of you who have visited us locally, Tariq is from South Sudan. North Sudan, and is Muslim, but also speaks Arabic. So what was your experience as an Arab speaker, but as a Christian traditionally, but also as a Black person?
Yeah, no, it's my identities kind of don't make sense to some people. Nisrine, which is a predominant name used in Muslim Arabic speaking.
Really? Nisrine is? Yes. Oh, wow.
Yes, it's a very, very, very common name. So
okay. What's the meaning of Nisrine?
It's actually Persian. But been co-opted in the Arab world for some reason. I think it means rose. It's like some sort of flower, but they're different. It's Nisrine, just wherever.
I love it.
And then back to your comment about, everyone definitely has their own life trajectories and things of that nature. I will definitely say all of this, from my studies, my time abroad, everything really up to this moment has been in large part because of the love and grace I've received from the Episcopal Church growing up in Tennessee and things of that nature, participating in mission trips, as I said. So I kind of owe it to them. And I had never really labeled myself as a humanitarianism, but it's something I very much embody and I very much strive to. But I also kind of see that as my Christian duty as well, for everyone to be humanitarianism. In terms of my identities, that's actually, I wrote my grad school, one of my grad school essays about this particular kind of phenomenon where, my identity somehow is a point of, it gets me into a lot of trouble, right? I do face some sort of anti-blackness or things of that nature. However, it's also been a point of mutual understanding and respect. So I'm able to share about myself, and then, people kind of, it then breaks down any preconceived notions about me, and my identities and things of that nature. But I think my experience, because I am an Arabic speaker and because I come from a country that's still very much part of the Arab world in terms of Sudan and South Sudan's history, right? I get a lot of legitimacy, and then my name is Nisrine. So yes, I get a lot of legitimacy. I'm pretty fluent in Arabic, and so it doesn't put me in too much trouble. However, I'm very aware that this is not the experience of a lot of Black individuals, especially Black women, who travel anywhere internationally, really, not just the Arab world. And so I think that's something that I'm very cognizant of. And it's also kind of funny, a lot of people, when I say that I'm from South Sudan, I think I make that clear distinction because of the religious differences because I don't want to lead people like astray. Like I'm not going to act like I'm Muslim, and things of that nature. I will not enter a mosque if I'm not welcomed, or if non-Christians are not allowed to enter. And so I always try to make that distinction, but it tends to confuse people because they're like, oh, well, I thought Sudanese people were Muslim. That's Northern Sudan that you're speaking about. But then also, oh man, I just lost my train of thought. But yeah, I don't know. I just like, a lot of people kind of will then be like, oh, well, South Sudan doesn't exist because they want to, like, it hurts people to know that a country's separated, right? I mean, it even hurts me, right? No one wants to see their country legitimately separate into two things of that nature. So that reconciliation process between South Sudanese and Northerners is still very much a thing that we are all grappling with, especially in the wake of the revolutions happening currently in Northern Sudan. So yeah, I hope that answers your question. It's very complicated.
It is, and I think one of the reasons why I find it so fascinating is. And maybe I'm going to dig a little too deep on a soapbox here, but like, I think we, and I say we as Americans, but maybe even a little more specific white Americans, we like forget how complicated the world is. Like I feel like a lot of Americans don't even know geography. That's why I mentioned it was in East Africa, because like we're Sudan. And so we forget the complications of the world, and so many other places have experienced so much more strife and war than we have in modern times. And I'm talking much more beyond just like world wars. I'm talking like Sudan, civil wars, civil war in El Salvador in the 80s, like all these things, right? So there's this displacement all over the world, whether it's IDPs and internally displaced peoples or actually leaving your country. And so here you have someone who grew up in South Sudan before it was even, or you were born there, they said, before it was even split. Was it already South Sudan yet?
So I was born in Northern Sudan still today.
North Sudan. Okay. Wow. So, okay, there you go. So born in North Sudan, what is today North Sudan, but of Christian upbringing with a Persian name who speaks Uba Arabic, or what did you?
Arabic.
It's like, but you now live in the States, and you're going to Georgetown. Like, it's so amazing how complex, but all the things that you embody because of that upbringing. And I think that to me is what, if we can finally have a conversation in America about what is America and strive for this concept of multi-ethnic democracy, which I think was definitely always a real goal, at least in certain individuals' minds. Like that is something that I want to uplift and elevate and say, like, these are the people that, like, man, they're like doing such amazing work and they have so much to offer. Like, why are we suppressing certain voices? Anyway, that's like I said, soapbox.
It's okay. That's one of the reasons I'm just relishing and enjoying my city so much. The Arab. So I personally have an issue using the term Arab world, or even more generally Arab, because it fails to encapsulate exactly what you said, the just immense diversity of this region that spans from Morocco, North Africa, Morocco, Mauritania, the most westernmost countries, to Iraq and Oman and things, right? So it's huge, right. And then also within this geographical area, there are various religious groups, right, and ethnic groups, right? So we have, for example, the Amazigh in Northwest Africa. We have the Copts, the Christian indigenous persons of Egypt. We have Syrians, Armenians, Turks, like, all of these various different, but I think the thing that kind of tends to bring us together is the fact that we speak Arabic. Unfortunately, right, though, those of us that do speak Arabic in Africa, south of the Sahara Desert, tend to not really always be kind of grouped into the rest. So I tend to use the phrase Arabic speaking world because when you think about the Arabic speaking world as opposed to the Arab world, it's a lot more big. Like, it's a lot more bigger than anyone kind of would previously imagine. It's a lot more racially diverse. It's a lot more ethnically, religiously diverse, right? So, absolutely. I could rant about that forever.
No, totally. I think these are really important things. I think we need to be, the West needs to be learning more instead of just like reading the news. Like even back in 2011, like Arab Spring. Like what is the Arab Spring? Who are Arabs? What are Arabs? Like, I mean, anyway. Yeah. You study a lot about integration, refugee integration. You've written on it.
Yes.
Guess give us an overview of kind of what some of those studies have been, but I'm really curious to also hear you dive a little deeper into integration. And I mean, we could go like stateside or also your experience in Jordan, specifically for Sudanese, which you were studying. So yeah, tell us a little bit more about the integration side.
Yeah. So, like I said, I studied Syrian refugee integration in Jordan. Jordan's a very incredibly complex and interesting case study to analyze refugee integration, as it is a country where most of its population is of refugee background. So what I'm hinting at is there are Jordanians, right? So like the Bedouins are kind of like the indigenous kind of Jordanians, but kind of throughout Jordan's short history, since gaining independence from the British, they've received wave after wave of refugees, starting with Palestinian refugees in around like 1948 with the establishment of the State of Israel, to Iraqi refugees, 2003 to 2007, large wave, to now Syrian refugees. Jordan is a very small country. Most of the country is desert. Over half of the population resides in Amman, which is the capital. So it's an incredibly cramped and just very crowded area. It suffers from very poor infrastructure. Jordan is also the third most water poor country in the world. So kind of taking all this, and then there's the Dead Sea, right? But I mean, you can't drink from the Dead Sea. Like, right. All salt water. So they have like a very small strip of sea coast to the Red Sea. But if that gives you any sort of like idea of like the situation that Jordan is in. And so I found it to be incredibly really cool to study like how these like wave after wave of refugees has not only impact Jordan like economically, politically, but like socially, right? Its demographics have changed. In fact, that the majority of Jordanians are of Palestinian descent. So it's just like really interesting. I am interested too, because in my time there, I met other minority refugee populations, such as Sudanese, Somali, Chechenian refugees as well, that had came from the USSR a while back. So I was just kind of like, well, wow, I would love to kind of like think about the experiences of people who come from like my similar like background, but also like that race aspect. So Palestinian, Iraqi, Syrians, they all kind of like tend to blend in really well in terms of being like racially ambiguous. You can't really tell someone is from this country just by looking at them. However, you can definitely tell if someone's Sudanese from yeah. Right. So I'm just interested, right, to what extent does that impact their experiences? So what I did was this is primarily secondary research. So I consulted a lot of like articles, and it's kind of hard because there actually isn't too much written about it, but I was able to parse things together. So I started first with looking at the general history of refugee flows in Jordan. Then I looked more specifically into the history of chattel slavery. So the enslavement of people, which in Arabic is the region is called Bilad Sudan, which means the land of the blacks. So Sudan, its name comes from the Arabic word aswad, which means black, right? So we are the land of black people. Yeah. So today is kind of used as sub-Saharan Africa. However, there is a very long and extensive history of enslavement of people from sub-Saharan Africa into the Arab world. And I would argue it manifests itself in the pretty similar ways as it does here in the United States in terms of anti-blackness, the use of blackface in media, right? Definitely, obviously it's very different. I'm not saying it's completely the same, but there are a lot of similarities. And so I was just like interested. So I did then research on that. A professor at Georgetown, she wrote an article that I kind of based my studies off of, detailing a hierarchy of aid that happens in Jordan. And so she identifies four kind of components to this hierarchy of aid, which is size, race, time, and awareness. So these four factors kind of go into how a refugee is perceived and therefore to what extent they're able to obtain humanitarian aid. So, for example, Syrians are the largest refugee population to date in Jordan. There are about 1.4 million Syrian refugees, the last time I kind of looked, whereas there are only 4,000 Sudanese refugees. So obviously, humanitarian aid is going to be targeted to the largest kind of group. Race, the extent. So that's where I then focused my thesis on is, this history, this very extensive of 1,200 years of slavery, Sudanese folks in the Arab world. So what does that look like today? And from reading testimonies, personal stories, narratives, right? I mean, racial discrimination, violence, things of that nature very much so do impact Sudanese refugees. So race, size, time, yeah. So the more recent a flow of refugee is, or the more likely they're the recipient of aid. And awareness. To what extent are these individuals viewed as refugees? Sudanese refugees, as you kind of know, Sudan's kind of far away, so they come via medical visas, via the airport. However, they're not viewed as refugees because they come from, take an airplane to go. They're viewed more as airport workers and things of that nature. And so it's just like, taking all this and combined, like, first of all, why does this even exist? And so I did some more research this past semester, wrote more about this hierarchy of aid, and I argue because of the humanitarian funding gap. The world of humanitarian works in a very, very, very limited, low capacity way. And so therefore it forces those on the ground working with refugees to have to rank refugee populations. And most of the time they go based off of citizenship or place of origin as opposed to need. It's definitely very problematic, and I think this definitely needs to be addressed in the humanitarian community.
So coming at it as a complete blind person. So what I hear you saying then would be so Syrians, the wave of Syrian refugees may have received more humanitarian aid despite actual need because of their size, race, the time of it, and the awareness, which again, it was like a big news thing, right? But are you saying that maybe the need is not as great because it sucks they're leaving the country? No one's saying that's good, but I'm saying their need is, hey, they have more opportunities maybe because they're Arab, going to another Arab nation, or they have more resources, or they flew there. Is that kind of what you've noticed? They have the more resources, but they're still getting that aid?
I would say that more recent refugee flows are definitely, and we see this kind of everywhere, right? As in the case of Ukraine, right? In terms of they are the primary targets of aid. So humanitarian funding, right? So when an organization is, creating advertisements or, asking for fundings from donors, because that's how the system of humanitarianism works. It goes based off of voluntary contributions. So you're going to kind of market it in a very particular way. Oftentimes, this falls based off of nationality or place of origin, as in the case of Palestinian refugees, right? It's much more complicated. So I like to use the phrase place of origin. And so I wouldn't say that because of, I think what I'm hinting at is it needs to be based more off of need as opposed to nationality alone, because at the current moment, it's just based off of someone's place of origin. And that is what determines it, as opposed to, even though, right, because as we know, refugees are normal human beings. You can be a doctor, you could be a PhD person, you could be a student, anyone can be a refugee. However, there is the issue of positionality. So, yes, we're all now on the same playing field in terms of we are, refugees, but it's just, that doesn't only then mean that we are in the same exact socioeconomic standing, same exact, social, political standing, there are definitely these different positionality things that we need to take in consideration, right? And so I think that's what I'm advocating for, more that vulnerable populations are also kind of targeted, and they are able to compete, or at least have the same chances of receiving humanitarian aid based off of their need alone, as opposed to their place of origin.
Right. Yeah, no, I mean, that makes sense. So if I didn't know anything about displacement and I all of a sudden like went to try to like give to some sort of organization, it's still generally pretty common that it's based off of, like you're saying, like position of origin, like, oh, give to the Ukrainian crisis or give to the Syrian crisis. Are there any organizations that you know of or have worked with that are doing a much better job at keeping it more generalized in need? Or
yeah, I mean, I think that would be the next kind of phase of my research. Even this past semester, focusing on the humanitarian financing gap and like why this hierarchy of aid even exists in the first place. I still very much stuck to the case study of Jordan, as that's an area I'm very much more comfortable with, and I had done some previous research. This whole kind of concept of hierarchy of aid is not like a developed concept. It's just kind of like it was primarily first coined by a Jordanian non-governmental organization called AARD Legal Aid in Jordan. However, I gave a presentation on it, and my classmates and I engaged like in a 1-hour conversation about our experiences in other places in the world, and like how it also kind of operates similarly. I would say simply from just like how I view things, the Ukrainian refugee crisis follows very much the same pattern of, okay, their size, they're the largest kind of like wave of refugees kind of happening currently. Their race, as we've seen the commentary about, these civilized, blue-eyed, blonde-haired individuals, they look like us. They are in need of saving, race, size, time, and then awareness, right? So, the media coverage surrounding Ukrainian refugees at the moment compared to the other refugees of, all of the other countries of the world, right? And so, however, I do need to do more kind of research on that. So I'm not too sure, actually. I have not looked at the performance of, all humanitarian organizations or NGOs, CBOs, and things of that nature. But I would love to see kind of one way that's kind of done right, I guess, and then see if that can be replicated. However, the system of humanitarianism is very much a system. It's very hard to break out of it, right? We are still operating under the same notion of refugees, under the same humanitarian structure as in 1951, when the term refugee was first coined and adopted by the UN, right? And so since then, times have changed for sure, right? Climate change is now a large kind of factor. However, that's not taken in consideration in the legal definition. So there's a difference between someone being a refugee and the fact that they are experiencing displacement, statelessness, things of that nature. But then there's also the UN, you are a refugee, you have a paper, you have a certificate, and then you are granted these rights and protections and things of that nature.
Yeah. No, it's super interesting. As you're talking, I kind of think about like modernity and like globalization through communication. Like, like in one sense, maybe there's more opportunities for refugees now more than ever because there's more ability for awareness and therefore funding, right? Even if done unequally. But then just like the dark side to the coin, like everything else, marketing is marketing. And
yes,
if you have more money, and you have a message you want to get across, that's going to trump
exactly
than other things that are out there. So
exactly, especially when you're operating such a large funding gap, right? We got the exact numbers, but I think it's like a $15 billion deficit, right? It's large, it's huge. It's based off of voluntary contributions. The U.S. is the largest donor in terms of like a government. However, they're also kind of like, okay, I will give you this money in exchange for, right, policy.
It's always an alternative, yeah.
Right, so obviously I'm very critical of the world of humanitarianism. However, I mean, I very much believe in its principles, right? Partiality, universality, things of that nature. And I'm only this critical because I want to see it do better. And yeah, we have more refugees and displaced persons now than ever before in the history of the world.
So what are we at? 80 million total? Something like
yeah.
that? This is kind of a side note, but I'm just curious. Do you feel like people, when you engage on these topics, do people find you threatening because of your criticism?
Yeah. Funny enough, I only really engage in these conversations with like my classmates and
like academics and people who are also like trying to solve.
It's, I mean, I don't really see the need, or it's never kind of come up in like casual kind of conversation. I mean,
it's because most people are going to look like deer in the headlights. Like,
yes, exactly right. It's so complex. However, in terms of like the classroom situation, and that's one of the reasons why I decided to pursue graduate school. I wanted to continually have these conversations, sit with my classmates, kind of, delve into these very, very difficult, sometimes contentious issues. But I'm thriving. I truly am.
Yeah. Going back kind of on integration. So how old were you when your family moved here to the States?
So I was born in June 1999. We moved in September 2000. So I was like,
okay. So very, very young. So what was your experience like integrating as a refugee, but yet kind of just straight up, like in a weird way, not born here, but fully raised here? Did you still have a lot of integration struggles, or was it a lot easier because you were able to like learn English faster and get into the school system? I mean, you're Black, right? So I'm sure that was already one factor, but then like, did you have much of an accent from the way parents spoke at home, or like, what were some of the integration struggles that, even though you were pretty much raised here, that you still had, if you're comfortable going into?
Yeah, no, for sure. Amazing questions, by the way. I'm really enjoying this conversation. So right, the irony, right? So coming from Sudan, my family is originally from South Sudan. Both my parents were born in Miridi, South Sudan group in Juba. But then, they came to Sudan, and then we eventually went to Lebanon, and then we resettled to Cleveland, Tennessee. So for those who don't know, Cleveland, Tennessee is a very small, way back when, was a very rural town, just right outside of Chattanooga, Tennessee. So between, there's some lightning, right between Chattanooga and Knoxville, Tennessee. So honestly, I grew up, when I think about childhood, I think I had a pretty normal childhood. I enjoyed playing with the neighborhood kids. I went to school. Like, things were pretty much normal. I will say, though, I did witness my parents struggling a lot for a lot of obvious reasons, primarily the language barrier. My dad speaks English like fluently, and he spoke to us in English in the home because he wanted us to integrate fast, quickly, no trace of accent and things of that nature. My mom, though, didn't get much schooling past like the secondary school in South Sudan. So she feels, and to this day, much more comfortable speaking to us in Adawi Juba. So it's cool, growing up in a home. However, when your one source of a language is from one particular person, or sometimes when you go to South Sudanese community gatherings and churches and celebrations, that's not enough to sustain a language and language development, especially when you're also simultaneously discouraged from speaking it. TV, schools, anything outside of the home is in English as well. So I did not grow up speaking Arabic, but I very much grew up listening and understanding it to this day, which has helped me learn Arabic. But yeah, I would say personally, from how I remember things, I had a normal upbringing. I didn't really ever feel like a refugee. However, yes, I do kind of remember seeing kind of some instances where my parents were not taken legitimately, or, people kept being like, what, I can't understand you. I remember like one time we went to McDonald's. My dad was like, I want a hamburger. And like the lady just did not understand. So we never got McDonald's, and I was like really sad. Yeah. But yeah, I'd say it's pretty normal.
So what, like, I mean, that's awesome, right? I'm glad to hear that. So then what was the trigger for like pursuing education on these topics so intensely? Like, was it just the holistic experience of growing up in that family and that home and what you witnessed, or was there a particular incident that like, man, I need to get back to, basically how I was raised as a refugee integrated in society. I want to give back to that. Like, what was the kind of the turning point for that?
Really great question.
Because what was your undergraduate was in what degree?
International and global studies. So basically globalization, how interconnected we are because of technology and stuff. But I would say, I mean, I've always had the spark. Those who know me really well know exactly what I'm talking about. And the fact that like I'm a very outspoken individual, very kind of out there go-getter. Always kind of, I speak my mind, like quite literally. I kind of stood out on podiums and kind of like expressed my thoughts on some issues. But I guess I would say the one kind of turning point in my life where I was just like, wow, like I have this voice, was in high school. So I went to West High School in Knoxville, Tennessee. For those who are familiar with West, it is the most diverse school in Knox County. So Knox County schools are usually kind of segregated by, white affluent schools or, Black lower economic. However, West occupies a very weird position in the fact that there's both. There is a train track, like really close to the school. And on one side, there's Sequoia Hills. The name speaks for itself, right? Very affluent, large houses, mansions, predominantly white area, very, very, very wealthy. On the other side, however, you have Section 8 housing, apartments, very kind of, middle class, but then also very lower middle class. So it's just like this really weird dynamic where you literally cross the train track and you're in a completely different world. So freshman year, I took regular college prep classes. Went to Northwest Middle School, a very diverse school, and I got okay grades. So then I entered high school. I did really great in my first year, so I was encouraged to take IB and AP and honors classes sophomore year. So that's what I did. However, the demographics just changed. It just completely changed. None of my friends from freshman year were in the same classes as me. It was a lot more white. I didn't feel, I would say I felt more of a culture shock and a hard time integrating in that situation than I did growing up in rural Tennessee. So kind of happened junior year. So it was just kind of like, this needs to be kind of addressed, right? We have the white side and the black side of school, right? So the black side is where the buses come and brings the students to school, and there's a cafeteria, free breakfast. Then the white side is like the entrance of the library where students park their cars. If they have cars, they usually get Chick-fil-A before the classes, right? And these are very normalized terms. No one thinks twice about it. I'm pretty sure there are terms that are still used today. So it was just like, this needs to be addressed. So I gave a presentation my junior year, my IB English class, analyzing the themes of race and socioeconomic class in 2 books that we read. And I was just kind of saying that this is a reflection of our school, right? Our school is incredibly segregated on race, off of socioeconomic class. White privilege does exist. I'm sorry, but I'm just going to say that to you guys. And and then this is how it relates to the book. For the most part, the presentation, it was very interactive. I consulted a lot of teachers before doing the presentation. As you know, any conversation about race can be very contentious. But everyone kind of agreed with me, and they were like, I had a lot of support in terms of the administration. However, there were a few of my classmates who did not like anything I said. And I kind of made a lot of enemies in the process. It contributed to my feelings of isolation, self-doubt. However, I've learned a lot. I've learned how to engage in these very, very, very difficult conversations in a very kind of careful manner and, inclusive and, not so accusatory. Not to say that my first presentation was, but, just much more cognizant of like just different perceptions. Because for me, I was just like, this is obvious. Like everyone knows this. However, that's not the case sometimes when speaking about contentious topics. And so, yeah, like I just remember like then senior year being very difficult because then I continued IB classes at West, but I then had some enemies, people who thought very differently of me and things of that nature. However, I wouldn't change that experience for the world. It's definitely contributed to the person I am today. And then I guess I would say the second kind of life-changing moment was when I studied abroad in Jordan, because I was just kind of like, wow, like, I've always been interested in like culture, international politics, but then I was just like living in the Middle East, interacting with refugees, right? Like I drove by Zaatari refugee camp, the largest Syrian refugee camp in the world. You're too intimately close to these issues, and for some reason I can't see myself removed from it, and I just feel like I have an obligation to get involved somehow.
Yeah, I'm curious.
Yes.
What was it that experience in high school allowed you to keep going without being silent? In other words, let me ask it differently.
Yes.
How come that experience didn't prevent you from moving forward? Because oftentimes those experiences, I think, put doubt in what you mentioned, right? Doubt, self-doubt, and all that stuff. Mm-hmm. Why'd you keep going? Maybe why didn't you just be like, I guess this isn't for me? Like, was it just like was it that spark? That spark was like, gotta keep going. Like, I don't care.
Truthfully, like in complete transparency, I don't know. I really think it's like my nature. Like it's very much. I was talking to a really close friend of mine the other day, and she was just kind of like, I was telling her everything I've done, and I've engaged in some advocacy efforts as well in my time in Georgetown, things of that nature. And she was like not surprised that I was doing this, and she was just like, you've always been this kind of way. Like this is just something of my nature. And so I would say that like, senior year of high school, I kind of, I guess, died down a little bit because of self-doubt and kind of the hurt that I received from some of my classmates. But then first semester, freshman year of undergrad, there was a White Lives Matter rally in a nearby small town, Shelbyville, Tennessee. And I went with two of my girlfriends as counter protesters, of course. I was like, we went as counter protesters, we're counter protesters.
Make that clear.
Yes. And we came back to school, right? We were featured on our school's newspaper, and then we decided to host a campus-wide conversation about the state of race relations in this area, right? Rural Tennessee. Like this is where we are at, where we are literally having neo-Nazis and KKK members, right? Like down the hill from our school. Like, what does this mean? And how can we all strive to make this campus a better place and more secure place, especially considering Sewanee's history, right? The University of the South, inextricably tied to the Southern aristocracy and history of slavery and segregation in the South. So, I guess just being so intimately like close to these issues, I just feel like I'm like in a box and I can't escape them, right? And so what am I going to do? I'm going to face them head on.
Snowball rolling down the hill. Just keep
exactly.
No, so I guess then on that note, like how does that kind of tie into some of the studies done with gender, women and gender equity? I mean, because as a female and Black and refugee, like all these things, right? Like, however, whether you fully identify like as a refugee growing up here, even, but like, I'm sure that fed into a lot of that. And what are kind of your studies around that now? And what do you want to see happen? And what do you see lacking overall?
Yeah. So I minored in women and gender studies. Absolutely loved it. I think it provided, when I analyze concepts or readings or assignments in classes, I always kind of go from that racialized lens and then also the gender lens. That's definitely been helpful in helping me create more nuanced and original ideas about certain topics. I would say I don't focus exclusively on gender, or at least as much as I did in undergrad. However, it's nonetheless stayed a very integral and vital part of my analytical kind of strategies in grad school. And so it's been really, really great. I think gender in the Arab world is also incredibly interesting and very complex, especially when engaging in conversations with people who have some preconceived, oftentimes incorrect notions about Muslim women and to what extent they have freedom and things of that nature, but then also kind of juggling issues here domestically with women's rights and reproductive rights and things of that nature, right? So it's very much a juxtaposition and something I'm very interested in. When I was in Jordan, I interned with a local community-based organization that works with refugees in Jordan. I attended a few of their graduation ceremonies in nearby cities of predominantly Syrian refugee women who participated in their like women's empowerment programs and then graduated, and they got like these certificates and things of that nature. It was cool to interact with beneficiaries one-on-one, and Arabic greatly helped with that. So that was really cool. And I then like realized the power of language and the fact that it's definitely a community builder. I interacted with Syrian women who, of course, wore hijab, kind of very normal for Muslim women in the region, but then also the niqab, which is the, you cover your, like everything from here, basically like your eyes. And so kind of like, at first I was just very daunting, just kind of like, like why would someone ever do this, blah, blah. But then you kind of interact with them and they crack jokes and they like literally just act however they want and they feel the most safe this way. And who am I to be like, you are being oppressed when another woman's like, I feel so empowered this way, right? Like, I don't know, like it was just very, 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 very incredible, and has definitely kind of just changed my preconceived notions about, veiling of the face, especially things of that nature. So, yeah, in my studies, I definitely have that gendered aspect, but it's not my primary goal. I think in Georgetown, a new kind of topic that's in the world of DC that I'm interested in and would love to like learn more about is the women, peace, and security nexus. So the role that women have in sustaining peace, conflict resolution, and just overall economic prosperity. So just the need to have women, right? Like the UN's goal of having 50-50 male-female representation in all levels of the UN organization in order to promote security and peace is something I'm also just interested in. And hopefully I take more classes about it.
Yeah, I think representation is really important, right? And the interesting with gender is that's a pretty equal representation demographically, right? Yeah. Like it's one thing to talk about, like, say, LGBTQ and be like, okay, like, how do we talk about rights and all these things when it represents X amount of population? Sure, there's a large population that maybe we don't know about, or they're not comfortable coming out, but still, like, that's small. Even when you look at like Black people represent this amount of the US, and it's like they still need to be represented, but what's that equal distribution look like? But with gender, at least male, female, it's like you got pretty equal representations, but man, representation in corporate culture, hey, all this stuff. I mean, it's like, And I get it. We're coming out of different times where the family unit was viewed differently, and those are some intense topics. I mean, it's interesting too, because you said something earlier about like seeing the female in the veil and realizing, like, who am I to tell her she's oppressed, right? And this comes down to what I think is maybe one of the more fundamental important things, at least as Americans, but hopefully worldwide as humans, we realize, which is everyone is an individual. We all have the need of respect and dignity as a human, but like we have to make our own decisions. And so, yeah, like she's got to make her own decision. You can't tell her she's oppressed. You're not her. And I think that's a similar message that like the far left needs to hear too, right? Like far right, far left aren't too different from each other. We're like force feeding they're force feeding concepts.
Yeah.
And this is the part that scares me the most about where we're at, is the inability to engage on a level like this, right? Like we're going to disagree on something, no doubt, but like, how do we learn from each other and not be so extremist? But it seems like the only information or content you see via social media and any media is the extremes. And then it's like people just keep feeding that further and further instead of being like, maybe if that family wants to have a traditional life with 10 kids and all, like, okay, like at the end of the day though, vote, democracy. That's what's going to decide these things, but we don't seem to have that freedom anymore.
I mean, it's multiculturalism is something I think everyone is kind of grappling right now, and all of these diversity, equity, inclusion initiatives happening everywhere, like from schools to corporate life. So, it's just something to like that I think everyone's just like grappling with. It's kind of unfortunate that, there are so many examples in the world where we just don't see coexistence because of various religious, ethnic differences. I mean, South Sudan's a prime example of kind of all of that stuff.
Yeah.
But I don't know. I still kind of remain optimistic, and the fact that there's a lot of advantages to diversity and multiculturalism more than disadvantages, and for us to like really focus in on those advantages, like hone in on them. So yeah, that's
absolutely. Well, stay hopeful and don't silence your voice. Keep it going. And, for the sake of time and the listeners, like, I'm sure we could talk so much more because I just think your story is fascinating and there's always more to learn. But yeah, like, keep it going. Keep your studies. Don't be silenced. And even if something your junior year happens again, speak louder. Now you're not stuck in a singular high school scenario. So,
well, now I can speak in multiple languages. So
there you go. You got some real influence, more than I can say. So, and most of America, for that matter. Awesome. Well, Nisrine, thank you so much for the time today. And I'm sure people will find something hopefully of value and chew on it, learn something, and take it on with them. And hopefully we keep engaging in these conversations. So
hopefully.
Yeah. In the meantime, good luck on your studies and hope to stay in touch.
Thank you.
Yeah. Cheers.
Get mad. Get mad, Priest Coffee.